June 1943. The air inside the testing range at Aberdeen Proving Ground shimmered in the summer heat as a small crowd of American officers gathered around a strange contraption barely 5 feet long. It looked like a metal tube stolen from a plumbing workshop, mounted on a crude rest with wires dangling from its breech like the innards of a stripped-down radio. A young ordnance lieutenant wiped sweat from his forehead and cleared his throat. The demonstration was about to begin. None of the officers standing behind him expected much. Most considered it a novelty at best, and a childish experiment at worst. Behind the firing line, 2 observers stood apart from the others. Captain Henry Colton of the 1st Infantry Division had come straight from North Africa, where he had watched Stuart tanks get blown apart by German 80s as if they were made of aluminum foil. Next to him stood Sergeant Bill Carter, a wiry Texan who had stormed Kasserine Pass and lived to tell the tale. Both had seen what German armor could do. Neither believed that a lightweight American tube launcher, held on a man's shoulder, could make any difference. The lieutenant steadied himself, stepped back, and signaled. A technician placed the warhead into the front of the tube. It clicked into place with a hollow metallic note. Carter leaned toward Colton and whispered, "Looks like a toy." Colton didn't argue. Even the warhead seemed unimpressive, more like a child's model rocket than something capable of killing a tank. The lieutenant took a breath, locked the trigger mechanism, and shouted for everyone to clear the backblast area. Then he squeezed the firing switch. A burst of fire erupted behind him, sending a wave of heat across the sand. The projectile sailed through the air with a sharp hiss and struck the test plate 50 yards away. A few officers laughed at the odd flight pattern. But the laughter stopped the instant the warhead detonated. The plate, a thick slab of hardened steel taken from the side of a captured German Panzer III, lit up with a blinding flash, and then revealed a neat smoking hole punched straight through it. Colton blinked. Carter took a step forward. The lieutenant lowered the tube, his ears ringing as much from the explosion as from the sudden silence behind him. No one laughed now. 2 days later, a report crossed the desk of Colonel Harold Dennis of the Army Ordnance Department. It summarized the Aberdeen demonstration with clinical detail, referencing penetration values, launch reliability, misfire rates, and projected production numbers. What it didn't include was the shocked expressions of officers who had walked into the range expecting a gimmick and walked out believing they had just seen the birth of a battlefield revolution. Dennis reread the conclusions twice. The weapon was rough, primitive, limited in range, and dangerously tricky to use. But it worked. And in warfare, especially against armor, that was all that mattered. Across the Atlantic, the German army had already formed its own opinion of early Allied anti-tank efforts. Reports from Tunisia mocked the British boy's rifle, calling it outdated and nearly useless. The Americans, German officers wrote, were no better. Their armor was too light, their guns too weak, their infantry anti-tank weapons barely worth the ammunition used in training. The idea that the United States could field a handheld tank killer seemed absurd to armored formations raised on the power of the Panzer and the invincibility of the Tiger. German propagandists fed the myth to their soldiers, convincing them that Allied infantry could do little more than throw grenades and pray, but aboard troop ships bound for England, far from German eyes. American soldiers were meeting the first crude bazookas. The training grounds of southern England echoed with the roar of rockets as squads practiced firing from pits, from hedges, from behind simulated walls. The men joked about the strange new tube. They joked about its weight, its smoke, its habit of spitting sparks backward with enough force to set a blanket on fire. But when a practice rocket tore through a steel plate or ripped into a decommissioned tank hulk, the laughter faded. Infantrymen who had once felt helpless against armor began to feel something new. Possibility. Private Harold Mason of the 29th Infantry Division wrote to his brother, describing the first time he fired one. He wrote of the shockwave, the acrid smell, the fear of misfire, and the surge of adrenaline as he watched the rocket spiral toward the target. He confessed that he didn't fully trust the thing yet, but admitted that it was the first time in his life he believed a single man could stand firm against a tank. In the summer of 1943, the bazooka was still an infant weapon. Its range was short. Its accuracy depended on nerves. Its backblast painted glowing signatures across firing positions. German intelligence reports that did mention it called it clumsy and unimpressive. The weapon was dismissed as a short-range gimmick, a crude toy that might trouble older Panzer models but would never threaten the thick armor of the Tiger or Panther. Yet something deeper was happening behind the scenes. American engineers were already developing improved warheads, refining stabilization fins, redesigning batteries, and experimenting with new propellants. The rapid pace of American industry meant the bazooka evolved month by month. Test models were shipped to units almost as quickly as failures were analyzed. Soldiers training in the English countryside noticed the improvements. The tubes became lighter, the triggers more reliable, the rockets more stable. Rumors spread quietly through the ranks. The Germans didn't know what was coming. Meanwhile, German units preparing for future clashes still believed their armor ruled the battlefield. Tank crews cleaning their Tigers in the depots of occupied France drank coffee and laughed at the idea of Americans with shoulder-mounted rockets. In letters home, some described Allied weapons as crude imitations of German technology. Others dismissed them outright as propaganda. A Tiger commander stationed near St. Lo wrote that no infantryman could harm his tank unless he was foolish enough to run directly under the barrel. Confidence hardened into arrogance, and arrogance into blindness. By the spring of 1944, the gap between belief and reality had grown into a chasm. The Americans knew the bazooka was imperfect, but improving. The Germans still believed it was a toy. And on both sides of the Atlantic, no one yet realized that the hedgerows of Normandy would become the perfect laboratory for proving which belief was true. For now, the weapon remained a curiosity, a small tube that soldiers joked about in the evenings and practiced with in the mornings. Yet in those moments on the training ranges, as rockets arced into steel plates and night skies flickered with backblast flames, the future was already being written. The laughter that followed the early tests would eventually vanish. And when German tank crews entered the maze of the Bocage country, they would discover that the toy they mocked had quietly transformed into something far more dangerous. The stage was set. The weapon no one took seriously was about to meet the battlefield it had been born for. The men of the 29th Infantry Division learned quickly that no amount of training truly prepared anyone for combat. By early 1944, the practice ranges of England had become familiar ground to soldiers who had been drilling for nearly a year. But the real classroom, the one that mattered, waited across the channel. And no weapon sparked more debate in the muddy tents and crowded mess halls than the bazooka. Some loved it, some distrusted it. All feared it in one way or another. The thing could save your life or take it just as easily. Sergeant Frank Mallory understood this better than most. He had been assigned as a bazooka instructor despite having fired only a handful of rockets in his life. His job was to turn nervous farm boys and factory hands into confident anti-tank teams. Mallory believed in the weapon's potential, even if he didn't yet trust its flaws. Every morning, he gathered small groups near the hedges bordering the training field. The skies were often gray, the grass soaked with a cold dew that clung to boots and socks. The men would shoulder the tube, listen to Mallory's warnings, and then launch practice rockets at rusted metal silhouettes. On one particularly cold morning, Mallory stood behind Private Mason, the same young soldier who had written home about his first bazooka shot. Mason inhaled and tried to steady his shaking hands. The weapon felt heavier today. The range officer called out the signal. Mason fired. The rocket hissed downrange, clipped the edge of the target, and detonated against a mound of dirt. A column of smoke rose. Mason exhaled loudly and lowered the tube. Mallory stepped beside him. Better, but not good enough. If that's a Tiger, you're dead. Mason nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. Sir, what if it doesn't fire? What if the battery dies again? Mallory didn't answer right away. The misfires haunted him too. He had seen rockets dribble out of the tube and fall pathetically at the shooter's feet. He had seen a backblast ignite someone's coat. And he had seen rockets veer wildly off course. Yet he also knew the weapon was improving. The latest shipments had more reliable ignition packs, and the new M6 rockets were reportedly far more stable. He placed a firm hand on Mason's shoulder. It's getting better. And so are you. Across the Atlantic, German analysts continued to underestimate the bazooka. Their technical reports mentioned it only briefly, usually folded into broader assessments of Allied infantry weapons. A few officers acknowledged that the early rockets could penetrate older Panzer armor, but most insisted that the heavy frontal plating of the Tiger and Panther rendered the weapon nearly irrelevant. They trusted their steel. They trusted the engineering behind their machines. They trusted the myth that German armor was unbreakable. Colonel Franz Heller, a career Panzer officer, embodied that confidence. Stationed with the 2nd Panzer Division in France, he routinely lectured younger officers about the superiority of German engineering. One evening, while his men cleaned their tanks in a dusty field outside Argentan, a lieutenant asked him about rumors of a new American anti-tank weapon. Heller laughed and waved the idea aside. A tube on a shoulder? That is a child's toy. Perhaps it frightens an old Panzer too. But a Tiger? Impossible. His crew nodded, reassured. They believed him, because for years, German armor had proven itself against every opponent it faced. The idea that a single infantryman could threaten a tank worth more than a small village seemed absurd. Yet the war was changing. American factories were producing rockets by the millions. Engineers in laboratories back home were refining shaped charge designs, improving penetration, and redesigning launch systems. The bazooka was no longer a prototype. It was becoming a mass-produced, evolving instrument of war. And by early 1944, the American soldier carrying one into battle was no longer an inexperienced recruit. He was part of a trained, coordinated team. Mallory understood this shift better than many. One night, as rain hammered against the canvas walls of the tent, he gathered Mason and 2 other soldiers around a map spread across a crate. A lantern flickered overhead. This, Mallory said, pointing to a cluster of hedgerows marked in thick pencil, is what you're going to see in Normandy. Everything here is close quarters. You won't be taking long shots. Tanks will appear suddenly, sometimes at 20 yards. They'll be slow. but they'll be armored like battleships. That's where the Bazooka earns its keep. Private Mason looked at the map, imagining the narrow lanes, the earth walls, the sudden ambushes. The thought of a tiger rumbling toward him made his stomach twist. What if they spot us first? Mallory looked him straight in the eye. Then you aim faster, and you pray. The training intensified with every passing week. New versions of the bazooka arrived with thicker wires, sturdier sights, and improved warheads. Mallory drilled the men relentlessly. Load, fire, reload, move, fire again. The backblast scorched the hedges and left black streaks across the dirt. Smoke clung to the air long after the rockets detonated. By April, the men were no longer asking whether the bazooka worked. They were asking how to use it best against German armor. The lessons came with cost. During one exercise, a misfire left a rocket half lodged in a tube. The training officer screamed at the team to drop the launcher and run. The rocket detonated seconds later, ripping the tube apart. No one was killed, but the explosion rattled everyone. Mason stared at the twisted remnants of the launcher and muttered, "This thing could kill us before we ever see a tank." Mallory approached him. There was no point pretending the weapon was safe. "It's dangerous, but so is a tiger. You choose which danger gives you a fighting chance." By early May, the beaches of Normandy loomed in the minds of every soldier. Rumors swirled about invasion dates, landing zones, and German defenses. The airfields buzzed with activity. The ports were crowded with infantry divisions, preparing to cross the Channel. Every day felt heavier than the last, as if history itself was gathering weight. On one of the final training days before loading began, Mallory gathered Mason and the other bazooka men for a last drill. The field was muddy from earlier rain. The clouds hung low, as if pressing down on the earth. A final rocket streaked toward a derelict armored vehicle and punched through its side with a bright flash. When the smoke cleared, Mallory spoke quietly. "Remember what you learned. Remember your timing. Remember that tanks aren't invincible. Not anymore." Mason nodded, gripping the tube more tightly than ever before. He no longer saw it as a toy. He saw it as a lifeline, a weapon that could decide whether his squad lived or died. Thousands of miles away, German officers still clung to their belief that American infantry could never seriously threaten their armored spearheads. They comforted themselves with arrogance, unaware that on the quiet fields of England, the men who would challenge that belief were readying for battle. Soon, the lessons learned in practice fields would be written again, this time in fire, steel, and smoke on the shores of Normandy. The first days after the landings were a blur of noise, fog, exhaustion, and confusion. The Americans had clawed their way off the beaches, but they had not entered the open fields they expected. Instead, they entered a world unlike anything in their training manuals, a place older than memory itself. Normandy's Bocage was not simply farmland. It was a maze. It was a fortress. And for the tanks that entered it, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. Private Harold Mason learned this the hard way on his third day inland. His squad pushed through a sunken lane so narrow that two men could barely walk shoulder to shoulder. The hedgerows on either side towered above them, packed with roots and earth so dense that they formed walls more solid than concrete. The morning light barely filtered through the thick greenery overhead. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of soil and crushed leaves. Sergeant Mallory walked at the front, scanning each bend. Mason followed with the bazooka, its weight familiar now, almost comforting. The men moved silently, aware that German patrols could be waiting around any corner. The crack of distant gunfire echoed across the countryside, occasionally joined by the deeper thump of tank engines. Around midday, as they reached a crossroads between two hedgerows, the ground beneath Mason vibrated. A low mechanical hum rolled across the fields. Every man froze. Mallory raised a fist. "Tank," he whispered. The vibration grew stronger. Then a sound cut through the air that every Allied soldier would learn to dread, the deep, slow growl of a tiger. It felt like thunder trapped inside steel. Mason swallowed hard. His hands tightened around the bazooka's grips. The hedgerow ahead trembled as something massive pushed through the brush. Branches snapped. Leaves rained down. The front plate of a Tiger I emerged like a monstrous face breaking through a curtain. Its turret swiveled slightly, scanning the lane. The tank's armor glinted beneath a layer of dust, its surface nearly vertical and terrifyingly thick. Mallory whispered, "Get ready." Mason's pulse hammered in his ears. He slid a rocket into the tube. His loader crouched behind him, whispering instructions he barely heard. The Tiger rumbled forward, inching into the lane. Its machine gun pointed straight down the path, toward the squad. One burst from that gun would cut them all down. Mallory's voice was a harsh whisper. "Wait for the sight! Don't fire yet!" But the Tiger didn't turn. It kept rolling straight toward them. Suddenly a shout echoed from the hedgerow behind them. "Panzer Grenadiers!" Automatic fire ripped through the lane. Bullets tore into the earth, spraying dirt into Mason's face. The squad dove behind a small embankment. Mason clutched the bazooka to his chest, trying not to breathe too loudly. Leaves shook violently as the more German infantry emerged behind the tank. "Pinned, front and back." Mallory crawled beside him. His expression was unreadable, calm despite the chaos. "We hit that Tiger now," he said, "or none of us leaves this lane." Mason nodded, though fear pressed against his ribs. Mallory gave him the signal. Mason rose to a crouch. The Tiger's bow machine gun opened fire, cutting branches overhead. The noise was deafening. Mason aimed at the tank's right track, the weakest spot he could reach from the front. "Fire!" Mallory shouted. Mason squeezed the trigger. A burst of flame shot out behind him. The rocket streaked forward. A second later, it slammed into the track assembly with a blinding flash. Metal fragments exploded outward. The Tiger lurched violently and stopped, its track blown apart. The tank stilled for a moment. Then its turret snapped toward Mason's position. "Down!" Mallory roared. The Tiger's main gun fired. The blast shook the entire hedgerow. Dirt showered the squad. Mason's ears rang. The loader grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back into cover. "Reload!" Mallory shouted. Mason's hands moved automatically. Another rocket slid into the tube. The loader slapped the back of it, signaling it was secure. Before they could fire again, a group of Panzer Grenadiers rushed toward their position, shouting and firing wildly. Mallory's rifle barked. Other rifles joined him. The lane erupted into a chaotic firefight. Mason tried to calm his breathing as he lifted the tube again. He focused on the Tiger, which was trying desperately to rotate its turret despite its immobilized track. At this angle, the side armor was partially exposed. Mallory saw it too. He pointed. "There, hit the joint under the turret." Mason steadied himself. The Tiger's engine roared as the crew tried to reverse. Mason fired. The rocket struck just beneath the turret ring. There was a sharp explosion, followed by a plume of smoke that escaped through the tank's rear vents. The Tiger's turret stopped moving. For a heartbeat, the battlefield went still. Then a muffled internal blast thumped inside the tank. Smoke billowed from the hatches. Mallory grabbed Mason's shoulder. "You got it," he said. "Finish the infantry. They'll be shaken." Mason barely heard him. The adrenaline made his hands shake uncontrollably. Around them, rifles cracked. Grenades burst against the hedgerows. The Panzer Grenadier, stunned by the loss of their armored giant, fell back into the brush. Some fled. Others tried to drag wounded comrades with them. The lane fell quiet again. Mason stared at the Tiger. Flames flickered inside the driver's slit. The tank that German soldiers believed nothing could destroy had died in a cramped Normandy passageway, killed by a weapon they once mocked. Mallory approached the burning hulk. "Look at the angle," he said. "Look at this terrain. Tanks are blind here. They can't maneuver. Bocage is infantry country." Mason nodded slowly. It made sense now. The thick walls, the narrow paths, the limited sight lines. All the advantages belonged to the men with the rockets. Word of similar kills spread through the American ranks. Tigers and Panthers ambushed at 20 yards. Tanks immobilized by shots to their tracks. Crews forced out of their steel beasts by infantry appearing from nowhere, like ghosts in the hedgerows. The bazooka teams were becoming something else entirely. They were not simply soldiers with a tube. They were hunters. And on the other side of the lines, panic rippled through German formations. Reports reached Colonel Franz Heller, who had once laughed at the idea of a shoulder-fired tank killer. Now he read message after message describing tigers lost in hedgerows, Panthers destroyed at close range, armor units terrified to advance without infantry screens. The Bocage had turned, and the Tigers, once kings of the battlefield, were discovering that in Normandy, the greatest threat didn't roar across open fields. It waited in the shadows with a rocket on its shoulder. By mid-July 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy had become a graveyard for armored legends. What had begun as scattered reports of tigers knocked out at close range was now a pattern, a quiet shift in battlefield reality that German armored battalions could no longer ignore. The Americans had arrived with a weapon the Germans mocked, dismissed, even joked about. Now, tank crews tightened their grips on their controls whenever their engines rumbled too close to a hedgerow. They looked at the thick green walls not as scenery, but as potential death. Private Harold Mason had grown used to the smell of burned armor. It clung to the Bocage like a permanent fog, mixed with smoke, dust, and the sweet rot of crushed leaves. His squad had been fighting without rest for days, advancing foot by foot toward Saint-Lô. Every lane felt the same, narrow, choked with brush, and far too quiet until suddenly it wasn't. That morning began with the distant rumble of artillery and the sympathetic shaking of the earth. Mason lifted the bazooka onto his shoulder and adjusted the strap that dug into his neck. The leather had worn down to a thin, soft strip from constant use. His loader, Corporal Lee Parker, checked the rockets in his pack. Mallory stood ahead of them, scanning the twisting lane with the calm alertness of a man who had survived enough battles to know that experience was no armor at all. "Armor reported ahead," Mallory said quietly. "At least 2 tigers. Moving slow." Parker exhaled sharply. "You think they know we're here?" Mallory shook his head. "They don't know anything in this terrain unless they step on it." They advanced cautiously, every boot step placed with care. The sky overhead was a pale blue, but the lanes below were dark tunnels of green. Then they heard it. Not the growl of a single tiger this time, but the grinding thunder of multiple engines working against the soft French soil. Mallory motioned for the men to take positions along the hedgerow. Mason knelt behind a thick tangle of branches and raised the bazooka. Through a small gap, he saw movement. The first tiger crawled into view like an iron beast, forcing its way through a living forest. Its hull was scratched, streaked with mud, and patched with makeshift repairs from earlier engagements. A second tiger rolled behind it, its bow gun twitching like an anxious eye. The lead tank paused. The turret turned slightly, searching for threats it couldn't see. German armor doctrine had been built for open fields, sweeping assaults, and long-range engagements. Here, inside this leafy labyrinth, the tigers were blind giants. Parker whispered from behind Mason, "Loaded." Mason didn't answer. His breathing slowed. For a moment he felt the familiar fear, the same fear he had known on the training fields in England. But it was different now. The fear no longer paralyzed him. It sharpened him. Mallory touched his shoulder once, a silent signal. Mason rose. The tiger's side plate filled his view. At this range, less than 20 yards, the armor almost seemed close enough to touch. He steadied the tube and fired. The rocket streaked forward and slammed into the side of the tiger's hull with a thunderous crack. Flames burst through the ventilation grates. The tank rocked from the blast, stalled, then caught fire from within. Smoke billowed from the hatches. Mason ducked as the second tiger's machine gun erupted, spraying the hedgerow with furious bursts. Parker yanked him back into cover. Reloading. The second tiger lurched forward, swerving around the burning tank. The commanders inside must have sensed the ambush, but chose to push through rather than reverse. A mistake born from desperation. Mason pressed his back into the earthen wall as bullets shredded branches above his head. Leaves rained down like confetti. Parker shoved a second rocket into the tube. "Ready?" Mallory barked. "Hit the engine deck this time." Mason braced himself, rose again, and swung the tube upward toward the tiger's rear quarter. The tank turned toward them, its great turret rotating with slow menace. He fired before the turret could center on him. The rocket struck the engine compartment. A violent explosion tore open the rear plating. Flames erupted in a roaring blast. The tiger stopped instantly. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the hatch opened, and a German crewman stumbled out, coughing and covered in soot. He collapsed face first into the road, hands raised weakly. The rest of the crew followed. None carried weapons. None seemed to have any will left to fight. Mallory stepped out of the hedgerow with his rifle raised. The remaining Americans moved to secure the prisoners. Mason lowered the bazooka and let the tube rest against his leg. The heat from the rocket exhaust still clung to the metal. Parker muttered, almost in disbelief. 2 tigers, 1 team. Mason didn't answer. He stared at the burning hulks, their towering silhouettes losing shape in the rolling smoke. The tanks that had rolled across Europe with an aura of invincibility now smoldered like any other target. Word spread through the battalion by nightfall. By morning, through the division. By the end of the week, reports across Normandy told the same story. American bazooka teams were dismantling German armor at ranges so close the tank crews never had a chance to respond. A weapon once dismissed as a toy was reshaping the battlefield one hedgerow at a time. And across the crumbling German line, the shock ran deep. Tank commanders who once scoffed at the idea of infantry killing tigers now briefed their men with grim warnings. Panzer grenadiers were ordered to march ahead of the tanks, clearing every lane. Crews slept inside their vehicles at night, engines off, hatches cracked open only from fear of another close-range rocket. For the Germans, the realization came too late. The bazooka was no longer a curiosity, no longer a crude experiment. It had become a symbol of the American way of war. Fast improving, mass-produced, simple to learn, and deadly when placed in the hands of determined soldiers. As the Hedgerow battles gave way to open ground, the Americans pushed east, leaving behind a landscape littered with burned armor. The bazooka teams followed them, carrying the same tubes that had turned Normandy's lanes into graveyards for tigers. In the end, the transformation was undeniable. German troops had laughed at the bazooka. They had called it weak, makeshift, even childish. But in the Bocage, where the battlefield shrank to 10-yard duels and every shadow could hide an ambush, the toy became something else entirely. It became the equalizer. It became the weapon that taught even the most feared tanks in the world that no armor was thick enough, no engine loud enough, and no reputation strong enough to silence a determined soldier with a rocket on his shoulder. And in that brutal education lay the final truth of Normandy. Victory did not belong to the loudest machine or the heaviest steel. It belonged to the soldier who adapted, who learned, who dared. It belonged to the bazooka team waiting patiently in the hedgerows, ready to prove once more that the smallest weapon could change the course of the largest war.